They mocked the ragged figure as if he were nothing, unaware they were laughing at a man whose name once echoed on battlefields. The storm slammed against the city, lightning splitting the sky, while Henry Riley, a ghost draped in torn fatigues, stood frozen before the glass. Beyond it gleamed a silver Aston Martin, untouched by time, unsolvable by every so-called expert who had dared touch its engine. With slow, deliberate steps, he crossed into the pristine showroom, his soaked boots leaving dark scars on the white tiles. The laughter rose as the old man rasped, "One meal, let me fix it." His voice was gravel, eroded by silence and secrets. The salesman sneered, not knowing this stranger's hands had once brought lifeless machines roaring back under enemy fire, where one mistake meant death. Tonight was no boast, no glory. It was survival, and what followed would crush their arrogance, spark headlines across the nation, and prove that Henry Riley was far more than a starving drifter. His story was just beginning. Before we go further, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always inspiring to see these stories reach around the world. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss tomorrow's special video. Now, let's dive in. The wind howled through the city, carrying the storm closer. Across the street, old Henry, the man whispered to, talked to engines, watched the warm glow of prestige motors. They saw only rags, but the engines had told him truths no mechanic could understand. Rain lashed down, drenching him, but his pale sky-colored eyes never left the polished chrome inside. Once he commanded men and machines in chaos. Now, only hunger gnawed at his ribs, and a tremor betrayed his hands. He inhaled sharply, crossed the road, and stepped into the cathedral of wealth. Cars worth more than houses gleamed under soft light. A young salesman, Kyle, looked up, irritation flashing across his face. "Can I help you?" The words dripped with contempt. "The Aston Martin. The engine isn't breathing right," Henry rasped, pointing toward the service bay. Kyle smirked, mocking. "Breathing right? Our mechanics are the best. I think they know what they're doing." He moved to push Henry back out the door, but Henry's eyes didn't waver. "I'm here to fix it." "One hot meal? That's all." Kyle burst out laughing, calling over two colleagues. "Guys, check this out. He wants to fix Mrs. Davenport's Aston Martin. For a sandwich!" Their laughter echoed until the heavy footsteps of Mr. Preston cut through the room. The owner's frown deepened. Mrs. Davenport's car had humbled every mechanic in his shop for a week, and pressure was mounting. His gaze locked on Henry. Something in those worn eyes, a certainty no beggar should carry, made Preston pause. "You think you can fix it?" he asked coldly. "I know I can," Henry said. Preston, a gambler at heart, smirked. "Fine. Fix the car, and dinner's on me, the best in town. Fail, and you'll scrub my floors with a toothbrush." The salesman snickered. Henry just nodded. "Deal." Henry Riley moved toward the service bay, each step deliberate, heavy, as if he carried storms inside his boots. The three seasoned mechanics froze, their tools hanging midair. Tension crackled like electricity. "Who's this?" growled the lead mechanic, a barrel-chested brute named Gus. "He's your new consultant," Preston said with a sly wink. Gus sneered openly, scanning Henry from head to toe. "You've got to be kidding me." Ignoring him, Henry approached the silver Aston Martin, majestic even in silence, a wounded beast waiting to breathe again. He laid a calloused hand on the hood, eyes closing as though in prayer. The mechanics smirked among themselves. "What's he doing?" one muttered. "Talking to the car gods," another snorted. Henry's eyes opened, sharp as steel. His voice was steady now. "It's the fuel pump. Not the original. A modern replacement, miscalibrated. Pressure's wrong. The engine's drowning itself," Gus scoffed. "We checked the fuel pump. It works." "You checked if it pumps fuel," Henry corrected softly. "Not if it pumps it right. There's a difference." He pointed to a tiny valve near the engine's base. "That regulator is delicate. Your new pump force is too much, too fast. The engine is choking." The mechanics exchanged uneasy glances. They had obsessed over diagnostics and electronics, overlooking the elegant simplicity of the machine's true design. Still, Gus refused to yield. "And how would you know that?" Henry's gaze dropped to the faint, faded tattoo on his forearm, an insignia of a long-disbanded unit. His voice carried a weight none of them could fathom. Let's just say I've spent my life with old soldiers. And this car? She's an old soldier too. She deserves respect, not shortcuts. He reached for a wrench, his trembling hands now steady. Hand me that flathead screwdriver, and I'll show you. The bay fell into silence, but for the subtle rhythm of metal on metal. For an hour, Henry worked with the precision of a surgeon, each movement fluid, every turn of the wrist echoing decades of mastery. The mechanics, once mocking, now watched in reverent silence. At last, he stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag. Try her. Reluctantly, Gus slid behind the wheel, doubt written all over his face. He turned the key. The engine roared alive. A deep, flawless purr filled the bay, vibrating through the concrete floor. The Aston Martin breathed again. From the shadows, Preston approached, eyes wide with disbelief. How did you do that? Henry offered only a sad, knowing smile. I listened, he said quietly. That's all. I just listened to what she had to say. Moments later, Preston led him into his office, a fortress of mahogany and leather, walls plastered with photos of shallow fame. But Henry stood unfazed. He had once stood in war rooms where nations hung in the balance. This was nothing. I don't know who you are, Preston said, circling him with a greedy gleam in his eyes. But you're a genius. An absolute genius. I'm just a man who knows engines, Henry replied quietly. He remained standing, ever alert, unwilling to let his guard down. A man who knows his way around an engine, Preston chuckled darkly. No, my friend, you are an artist. And I am a collector of art. He leaned forward, palms flat on the desk, eyes glittering with calculation. I have a proposition. A room in the back, 3 meals a day, a modest stipend. In return, you work for me, on the impossible jobs, the ones my so-called experts can't crack. It was more than Henry Riley had held in years. Shelter, food, purpose. Yet it felt like a gilded cage, bars built from comfort and control. He turned his gaze to the rain-streaked window, thoughts drifting to another storm, long ago. He was barely 20 then, ankle-deep in mud of a foreign land, rain pounding just like tonight. A jeep riddled with bullet holes lay silent before him, its engine their only lifeline. With nothing but a wrench and a prayer, he had dragged it back to life. He remembered the faces of the men who survived because of that sound, their fear, their hope. In that moment, he had been more than a mechanic. He had been a savior, but saviors fade. Returning home, Henry found no place in the world he had fought for. He took a garage job, married a good woman, held his daughter in his arms. Yet the ghosts followed. They whispered in camera flashes, screamed in the backfire of engines. He drank to silence them. Instead, he gave them power. His wife left, daughter in tow. He did not blame her. He had already become a shadow. Years blurred, town to town, job to job, always moving, never belonging. The road became his only home, the hum of engines, his only company. A master with machines, but broken in every other way. A throat cleared, Preston, impatient now. So, Henry, do we have a deal? He looked down at his hands, scarred, calloused, but steady. Hands that could still resurrect the dead, machines, maybe even himself. Slowly he nodded. On one condition. Preston raised a brow. Oh? No stipend, just the room, the meals, and... a car? A car? Preston laughed, shaking his head. My dear man, earn your keep and you may choose from the finest here. Not these, Henry replied, motioning to the sleek showroom trophies. Something old. Something broken. Something everyone else abandoned. Preston's smirk returned. Why would you want junk? For the same reason I keep breathing, Henry said softly, a faint smile crossing his weathered face. Everything and everyone deserves a second chance. The words hung heavy. Preston stroked his chin, eyes narrowing with intrigue. This wasn't just a mechanic. This was a story, a living legend who could become the face of Prestige Motors, the old master who fixed the unfixable, a Noah-heating gold mine. You've got a deal, Henry, he said finally, extending his hand. Welcome to the family. Their grip locked, firm, cold. Henry knew he was shaking hands with the devil, but he had walked through worse hells and survived. The weeks that followed blurred together. Henry was given a cramped, windowless room behind the service bay. It was no palace, but it was warm. Meals came greasy from a diner, but they filled his stomach. And in the lot waited his car, a rusted, beaten 1969 Ford Mustang, forgotten by time. Most thought Preston mad, but Preston was no fool. Soon whispers spread, a drifter who could breathe life into lost machines. People traveled from across the city, bringing hopeless wrecks, lifeless shells, and one by one, Henry Riley resurrected them. No fancy tools, no computers, only his hands, his silence, and his gift. He listened, the way only he could, to the murmurs of the engine, the sighs of the suspension, the heartbeat of the machine, and he understood. He felt content, in a fragile way. For the first time in years, Henry had purpose again. He was useful, he was respected, he was home, or as close as he could get. Yet the shadows clung to him. They whispered less often now, but they had not left. And then, without warning, a new ghost stepped into his life. A ghost wearing flesh and blood, from a past he thought long buried. She appeared like an echo, young, fiery red hair blazing under the afternoon sun, the same stubborn chin, the same sorrowful, knowing eyes that pierced through him. She could have been the daughter he'd lost long ago. She drove up in a beaten-down pickup, coughing black smoke into the air. She walked straight to him, hands stuffed into her pockets. "Are you Henry?" she asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly. "That's what they call me," he muttered, wiping grease off his palms. "They say you can fix anything." "I can try." Her breath hitched as though the words weighed more than steel. "Can you fix a broken heart?" For a long moment, Henry just stared. In her eyes, he saw the very grief that had haunted him for decades, the reflection of his own failures. His throat tightened. "I don't know about hearts," he said, voice thick with an ache he'd nearly forgotten. "But I'll take a look at your truck." As he leaned into the engine bay, she began to talk. Her name was Sarah, a journalist. She was digging into the hidden lives of homeless veterans, men discarded by the nation they bled for. She had heard whispers about him, the ghost, they called him, the man who had walked through hell and returned hollow. She didn't know his history. She didn't know about the medals, the battles, the legend of Sergeant John Henry Riley. To her, he was just an old mechanic in a dirty jumpsuit, a man with skilled hands and weary eyes. But as she spoke, something stirred inside him. This wasn't about cars anymore. This was about a second chance, to face the past, to break his silence, to finally lay his ghosts to rest. The truck's engine was a disaster, rusted, abused, neglected. It was a mirror of himself. But as he replaced worn parts, cleared clogged filters, and coaxed the machine back to life, Henry felt something unexpected: peace. For the first time in decades, he wasn't just repairing metal. He was stitching together the pieces of his own broken soul. When the engine roared back, smooth and steady, Sarah's eyes widened. "How did you do that?" He gave a small, tired smile. "I listened." That's all. She offered money. He waved it away. "Just tell my story." Tell their story, the forgotten soldiers. That's payment enough, she promised. And when her truck rumbled away stronger than it had in years, Henry felt something flicker inside him. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was his road home. But the road home is never straight. The past never stays buried. The silver Aston Martin he had repaired on that stormy night. It was no ordinary car. It belonged to Eleanor Davenport, wife of a retired general, a general who once commanded a brilliant young mechanic during the war, a mechanic named John Henry Riley, officially declared MIA, missing in action, for over 40 years. General George Davenport lived by precision. Every detail mattered. Every clue meant survival or ruin. So, when Eleanor returned, her Aston Martin purring like a predator finally tamed, he listened carefully. She described the strange old man in the greasy jumpsuit, a man who spoke softly, worked with purpose, and carried sadness in his eyes. "He called himself Henry," she said over tea. "Quiet, but his hands, George, you should have seen his hands. They moved like they were born from machines." The name hit the general like a bullet. Henry. Once, long ago, he had a boy under his command, a boy who could breathe life into dying engines, who earned the name the Magician in the chaos of war. That boy's name was John Riley, but everyone just called him Henry. Did he have a last name? The general asked, his tone carefully measured. Eleanor frowned. No, just Henry. Mr. Preston seems to think it's all some clever Noah-heating trick. He's already plastered the old man's face across a billboard. The Auto Whisperer. General Davenport rose from his chair and paced to the window, hands clasped tightly behind his back. It couldn't be possible. Sergeant John Henry Riley had disappeared during a reconnaissance mission decades ago. A jeep, a blown tire, an ambush in hostile territory, no survivors. He himself had signed the report. He himself had written the letter to the boy's family, one of the most painful duties of his command. He shook the thought away. Memory played tricks on old soldiers. It had to be coincidence. Yet something gnawed at him, an unease that refused to fade. 1 week later, the unease turned to certainty. Sarah's article appeared in the Sunday edition. It wasn't front-page news, but it was unforgettable. A feature titled, "The Ghost in the Machine, A Veteran's Second Chance." She wrote of a homeless mechanic named Henry, a man whose hands spoke to engines and whose silence carried a lifetime of sorrow. She wrote of his request, that the stories of forgotten soldiers not be lost. Davenport scanned the grainy black and white photo. The man's face was half in shadow, leaning against a rusted Mustang. But his eyes, and there, on his forearm, was the faded insignia of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. His unit, his boy. The porcelain cup rattled against its saucer. After all these years, alive. The world erupted overnight. The story was irresistible. The legendary Sergeant Henry Riley, long presumed dead, discovered in anonymity at a car dealership. Redemption. Valor. A miracle in grease-stained coveralls. National networks seized it. Within days, reporters besieged Prestige Motors, cameras flashing like muzzle fire. Microphones swarmed his face. Questions flew like bullets. Where had he been? Why had he hidden? What was it like to be hailed a hero again? Henry recoiled. He had spent years in silence, building his refuge among broken machines. Now the spotlight blazed hotter than he could bear. He shut them out, disappearing into the rhythm of wrenches and pistons. He spoke only through Preston, who reveled in the circus. Prestige Motors became a national spectacle. Sales skyrocketed. Preston Trade, Noah the Auto Whisperer, launched merchandise. T-shirts, mugs, even a line of the polished sprays. Henry took none of it. He asked for nothing, only his small room, his meals, and the quiet solace of engines. He kept fixing the impossible, even as his life spiraled into a chaos he could not control. And then she came. He was bent over the Mustang, smoothing rust with a steady hand, when he felt it, the weight of someone's gaze. He looked up. A woman stood in the bay's doorway, frozen in place. Early 40s, red hair that burned with memory, the same determined chin, the same sorrowful, piercing eyes as Sarah's, but heavier, burdened with years of grief. Her lips trembled, her voice cracked. "Daddy." The sanding block slipped from Henry's hand, thudding softly on the concrete. The word struck him like a bullet. He hadn't heard it in 40 years. He hadn't seen that face since it was small and innocent. His daughter, Sarah. He straightened, every bone protesting. He longed to rush to her, to hold her, to beg for forgiveness. But he froze. The ghosts rose up around him, whispering accusations. Drunk, coward, deserter, abandoner. How could he ask her for anything? She stepped closer, tears streaming. "I thought you were dead." "They told us you were dead." His voice broke, ragged with guilt. "I was," he whispered. "In a way, I was." The reunion was no embrace of joy. It was a storm, decades of silence, years of questions that had never found answers. Sarah, now a respected attorney with children of her own, had built her world on the crater left by his absence. His sudden return was not a gift. It was an earthquake. She had watched the news, seen the face of the man she knew only from fading photographs. Her mother had spoken of him with equal parts love and bitterness, a war hero to the nation, but a ghost to his family. They sat together for hours, words spilling and drying up in painful intervals. Henry confessed the war, the horrors, the blood, the endless ghosts. He told her about the bottle, about running until he was empty. No excuses, only the brutal truth. She, in turn, revealed her own scars. Growing up fatherless, the hollow space at every birthday, the quiet anger that had hardened into steel. Finally, she asked the question that had burned inside her since childhood. Why? Her voice cracked. Why didn't you come home? Henry stared at his scarred hands, hands that could heal engines but never his own wreckage. Because, he whispered, I was broken. Too broken to be a father. I thought you were better off without me. Her reply was cold as steel. That wasn't your choice to make. The words landed heavier than any shell he had survived. He knew she was right. They parted without resolution. Before leaving, Sarah handed him a photograph of two smiling boys, his grandsons, and a promise to call. A fragile thread of hope dangled in the storm of regret. In the days that followed, Henry felt something shift. The ghosts still haunted him, but they had changed. They weren't only the faces of soldiers lost. They were the life he had forfeited, the family he had betrayed. For the first time, he wanted not to outrun them, but to confront them, to try, however late, to atone. He buried himself in the Mustang. Each dent he smoothed, each patch of rust he erased, became an act of penance. He wasn't just restoring steel, he was sanding down the jagged edges of his own soul. Preston, blind to the storm within him, saw only opportunity. One morning he barged into the service bay, waving glossy blueprints. "The reunion tour!" he shouted. "You and Sarah, coast to coast in the Mustang." Father and daughter, healing the past on America's highways. "We'll sell the rights to a network. It's gold, Henry. Pure gold." Henry looked at the papers, then at Preston's greedy grin. For too long he had been used, a pawn of the army, of his demons, of this small, rapacious man. He had been a ghost, a legend, the auto-whisperer. Everything but himself. He clenched the blueprints into a crumpled ball. "No," he said quietly. Preston blinked. "No? What the hell do you mean, no?" "This car is not for sale," Henry replied. "And neither am I." He crossed the bay to his workbench, pulled open a drawer, and lifted out a small wooden box worn smooth with age. He opened it. Resting on faded velvet were a Purple Heart and a Distinguished Service Cross. Medals he had never shown another soul. Medals he had never felt worthy of. He pressed them into Preston's hands. "These are for you. Consider it a down payment." Preston's eyes widened. He knew them. He knew the weight of such decorations. Not in dollars, but in blood. His voice faltered. "A down payment for... what?" Henry looked at the gray-primed Mustang, gleaming with possibility. "For my freedom," he said, "I'm buying myself back." For once, Preston had no quick reply. The metals lay heavy in his palms, heavier than any profit margin, heavier than all his schemes. His sharp eyes flickered with something new, not greed, but awe, perhaps even shame. Numbers he understood. Inventory, Noah Hupp, loss and gain. But this was a currency he had never known. The cost of sacrifice, the price of courage. His voice dropped to a whisper. "What is this, really?" "It's a debt long past due," Henry said, his voice low but unshakable. "For 40 years I've been running. From the soldier I was, from the man I became. First, I drowned myself in a bottle. Then I buried myself inside these walls. You gave me a roof when I had nothing, and for that, I'll always be grateful. But don't fool yourself, Mr. Preston. You didn't save me. You just locked me in a different kind of prison. Comfortable, yes, but I'm done with cages." "So you're just walking away?" Preston demanded, the slick businessman's panic bleeding through his polished mask. His empire trembled at the thought. His golden goose was about to fly. "After all I've invested in you? After everything I've done?" "I'm not leaving," Henry corrected, his eyes narrowing. "Not yet. I'm offering you a deal, the last one I'll ever make." He motioned to the half-finished Mustang gleaming under the lights. "I'll complete this car. It will be the finest piece of machinery ever built in this shop. A masterpiece, one that will carry your name forever. And when it's finished, it will be yours." Preston's eyes widened. A car touched by the legendary Henry Riley. the auto whisperer. Its value would skyrocket, the publicity alone worth millions. Collectors would kill for the chance. In return, Henry said firmly, I want three things. First, you hand over the legal title to that battered pickup Sarah left here. Second, you give me enough tools and spare parts to set up a modest garage. Nothing flashy, just the basics. And third, you set me free. No contracts, no PR, no stage tours. You'll tell the world the auto whisperer has retired. Make up whatever story you like. Say I've gone home to family, say I've disappeared, but from that moment on, my story belongs to me. It was genius. Henry wasn't just bargaining for freedom, he was offering Preston a legend, the swan song of a master, a myth solidified in steel. And the shrewd mogul knew it instantly. This wasn't just a car, it was legacy. Priceless. And the medals? Preston asked quietly, still clutching the Purple Heart and Distinguished Service Cross. They're a gift, Henry replied. A reminder that some things have value no money can measure. For the first time, Preston saw him clearly. Not a broken mechanic, but a commander negotiating his own surrender. He extended his hand. You've got a deal, Henry. This time, when their hands met, it wasn't employer and employee, it was equals. What followed was a month of near monkish devotion. The world outside, reporters, cameras, hungry whispers, faded to nothing. The service bay became Henry's cathedral. With every wrench turn, every gleam of chrome, he wasn't just fixing a car, he was resurrecting it. That's when Sarah began to appear, at first cautiously, bringing coffee, sandwiches, words halting in the haze of oil and paint. She told him about her sons, his grandsons. Noah, the elder, quiet, bookish, always lost in pages. Luke, the younger, restless, curious, always tearing gadgets apart just to see their secrets. He's like you, she murmured once, a bittersweet smile tugging her lips. A weight crushed Henry's chest. A lifetime stolen, a bloodline he'd abandoned. He began setting aside pieces for them, an old carburetor polished like silver, a box of vintage spark plugs. With careful hands, he showed Sarah how they worked, as though each explanation were a bridge across the years. The wall between them began to erode. She saw not the ghost who'd haunted her childhood, but the man before her, scarred, regretful, yet steady. And he saw the strength she carried, forged not because of him, but in spite of him. One evening, as the Mustang's engine neared completion, she arrived with two small boys. They hovered shyly, their wide eyes reflecting the car's glow. Noah, Luke, Sarah whispered, this is your grandfather. Henry's heart stuttered. He wiped his hands, knelt, joints creaking with age. He looked into their young faces and saw his own gaze mirrored back. Hello, he rasped, voice thick. Little Luke stepped forward, pointing a smudged finger at the engine. How does it do that? He asked, a wonder in his tone. How do you make it go? And Henry, the man who had wandered in shadows for decades, finally stepped into the light of home. He began to explain, his voice rich with wonder. He told the boys about the alchemy of fire and fuel, how a single spark could awaken a sleeping giant. He didn't speak of horsepower or torque, but of breath, rhythm, and heartbeat. He wasn't just teaching them about an engine, he was entrusting them with a legacy. When the Mustang was finished, it was no longer just a car. It was art incarnate. The body shimmered in a black so deep it seemed bottomless, polished until it reflected every glint of light. Chrome accents blazed beneath the bay's lamps. But the real miracle waited beneath the hood, a symphony of steel tuned to flawless harmony. When Henry turned the key, the machine didn't roar. It sang, a hymn of power, low and perfect. Preston summoned a photographer. The legend of the auto whisperer's final creation had already crossed oceans, and a collector in Japan had paid a fortune to claim it. Cameras flashed, capturing what was less an automobile than the last testament of a master. Henry watched in silence, strangely detached. He felt no pride of possession. The car was never his. It was the toll he had paid to purchase his soul. His true treasure was not under fluorescent lights, but standing quietly in the doorway. Sarah, Noah, and Luke. When the session ended, Henry placed the keys in Preston's palm. Our bargain is complete, he said. Preston nodded, producing a second set of keys and a thick envelope. The pickup's title, as promised, and a deed, to an abandoned garage on the edge of town. call it a bonus for the medals. For once, the polished mask slipped, and his voice carried a rare sincerity. "Good luck, Henry." "You too, Preston," Henry answered. And without a glance back at the gleaming Mustang, he walked away, past rows of soulless machines, past the showroom lights, into the quiet gold of a setting sun. His family was waiting. By the world's measure, he had little: a battered pickup, a box of worn tools, a derelict garage. But as he looked at his daughter and grandsons, their faces glowing in twilight, Henry Riley knew the truth deep in his bones. He was the richest man alive. Yet freedom was no simple prize. Though he had broken free from Preston's chains, he could not escape the legend that clung to him. The forgotten garage was less anonymous than he had hoped. People found him, not reporters, but the broken. An elderly widow whose only lifeline was her faltering sedan. A desperate young man tricked into buying a ruined sports car. A single mother whose van had died, threatening her livelihood. They came not just for repairs, but for salvation. To them, he was more than a mechanic. He was proof that the lost could return, that the broken could be made whole. He never charged much, sometimes a meal, sometimes only a promise to pay kindness forward. His shop became a sanctuary of a different kind, one fueled not by profit, but by humanity. And with each engine he coaxed back to life, each soul he lifted, Henry felt fragments of his own spirit knitting together. He was finally doing what he was meant to do, not for fame, not for money, but for the quiet redemption of restoring what was broken. Life settled into a rhythm, steady as a perfectly tuned motor. He named the place Second Chance. There was no sign, no advertisements, only the sight of weary cars rolling in and departing whole again. Words spread softly, carried on whispers of gratitude through the city's forgotten corners. Dawn after dawn, Henry rose to the liturgy of his craft. He brewed black coffee on a battered hot plate, the aroma mixing with oil and steel. He stood at the doorway of his little shop, mug warming his calloused hands, and watched the city stir awake. For the first time in decades, he wasn't hiding, running, or bargaining. He was simply alive, at peace, at home. Then Henry worked, the work never ended, and he welcomed it. He nursed the sputtering heart of a nursing student's battered car, a lifeline she called her four-wheel scholarship. He listened as she confessed her fear of breaking down on the way to clinicals, and when the repairs were finished, he showed her how to check fluids, how to test tire pressure. He didn't just repair her engine, he repaired a piece of her courage. He tore apart the transmission of a carpenter's worn-out truck, the man's only livelihood. Another shop had quoted a price so steep it would have ruined him. Henry charged only for parts and asked instead for a promise, a hand-built bookshelf for his grandsons. He patiently taught a young widow, her world shattered by sudden loss, how to change her oil, how to swap a flat tire. She thanked him with silent tears she couldn't hide, tears Henry pretended not to see. His payments came in humble forms: a bag of vegetables from a community garden, a steaming pie left on his workbench, a crayon drawing of cars taped proudly to the wall. More often, it was simply the quiet joy of watching someone drive away lighter, straighter, less burdened than when they had arrived. In this new rhythm, his bond with Sarah deepened. Saturdays became sacred. She would bring Noah and Luke to the garage, filling the dim space with laughter and learning. Noah, ever thoughtful, sat perched on a stool with books stacked beside him, occasionally looking up to pose questions that revealed startling insight. "Grandpa," he asked one afternoon, "is leverage the force that moves your wrench, the same principle that moves the planets?" Henry smiled, answering with the universe translated into bolts and gears, gravity explained through the turn of a nut. But it was Luke who never left his side. The boy was instinct itself, his small hands quick, curious, reverent with tools. Henry started him with spark plugs, with sorting bolts into jars, teaching him the names of every tool. The boy absorbed it all, grease smudged on his nose, eyes shining with understanding. One day, holding up a carburetor, Henry said, "Most people see metal, springs, jets, screws. But this, it's a lung. It breathes, too much air or too much fuel, and it suffocates. Life is like that, Luke. It's all about balance. Remember that." The boy nodded, silent and intent. And in those moments, Henry wasn't just a mechanic. He was a grandfather binding broken links, restoring a family chain piece by fragile piece. Then, one crisp autumn evening, as he wiped his tools clean, a sleek black sedan glided to a stop outside. Its polished quiet didn't belong here. From it stepped a man in a dark suit, sharp and official. Old instincts surged. Years of running urged Henry to slip back into the shadows. But he stayed, rag in hand. He was finished hiding. The man introduced himself as aide to General Davenport. He bore no orders, only a plea. The general requested a private visit, soldier to soldier. The next day, dressed in his cleanest work clothes, Henry drove Sarah's old pickup to the general's grand estate, a place of manicured lawns, towering oaks, and wealth wrapped in silence. General Davenport awaited him in a study heavy with maps, books, and shadows of campaigns long past. The once formidable commander was older, his features softened, but his eyes, still sharp, still commanding, pierced through the years as he fixed them on Henry Riley. "Sergeant Riley," the general said, rising heavily from his leather chair, his presence filling the room. "It's good to see you." "It's just Henry now, sir," Henry replied, his tone measured, steady. The general gestured toward a seat. "Please, sit." There was no attempt at pleasantries. Even in his old age, he remained a man of mission, his every word sharp with urgency. "I didn't summon you to reminisce, Henry. I called you here because I face a problem, one so deep that neither my wealth nor my rank can bend it to my will." Henry expected to hear about a vehicle, perhaps a rare model beyond the reach of ordinary hands. But instead of pointing to a garage, the general tapped a silver frame on his desk. Inside was the image of a young soldier, his uniform crisp, his grin bright with untamed life. "My grandson," the general said, voice tight with grief. His name was David. He served 2 tours. He came home alive, but not whole. The words fell heavy. David carried scars no one could see. The war had followed him back, buried inside his chest. He could no longer sit at a table with family, hold a steady job, or breathe freely in silence. His refuge had become isolation, his prison, his own thoughts. "And now," the general's voice cracked, the steel of his discipline breaking, "he's vanished into the garage. He has an old Jeep from my father's war. He spends endless days dismantling it, reassembling it again and again. He speaks to no one, not to us, not to doctors, just the Jeep, and he cannot make it run. I fear he believes if he cannot repair that Jeep, he cannot repair himself." The general's eyes locked on Henry, stripped of authority, desperate. "They say you speak to engines, Henry, but I believe you see the men who hide inside them. I don't want you to fix the Jeep. I want you to save my grandson." It was the hardest request anyone had ever laid before him, to step willingly back into the storm he had tried to escape, to face the very shadows that once consumed him. Henry stared at the photograph of David, and in that haunted gaze, he recognized himself. He knew then. He had no choice. It wasn't a mission for the general. It was a promise to the broken soldier he once had been. The next morning, Henry arrived at the Davenport estate. No mechanic's jumpsuit, no disguise of the auto whisperer, just plain, clean clothes. He came as a man. The garage was vast. Immaculate, more laboratory than workshop. David stood at its heart, bent over the Jeep's exposed engine. His hands were blackened with grease, his body slouched, his spirit dim. The room was cluttered with parts, some polished with obsessive care, others abandoned, corroded. A battlefield of order and decay. Henry lingered in silence at the doorway, taking in everything. The true fault leapt out at him immediately. A cracked distributor cap, a frayed wire, child's play. But this wasn't about steel and fuel, not really. He stepped forward, lifting a wrench from the floor. His voice was low, careful. "Mind if I give you a hand?" David didn't raise his head, just a faint shrug, a trace of life in his shoulders. For hours they worked without a word. Henry made no move toward the obvious repair. Instead, he began small, polishing a single spark plug, straightening tools, tightening bolts along the fender. Slowly, he carved out islands of order in the chaos, his presence steady, patient, unjudging. At last, Henry spoke. His eyes were on the Jeep, his voice nearly a whisper. "She's an old soldier," he murmured. "Sometimes they grow weary. Sometimes they forget why they fight. For the first time, David froze. His hands hovered above the engine, then his head lifted. His eyes, bloodshot, suspicious, wounded, finally met Henry's. "I knew dozens of Jeeps like this," Henry continued, his gaze distant as though transported back to distant battlefields. "They'd come in crushed, shot to hell, or blown apart. We'd cobble them back together with scraps and sheer will, and send them back into the fight. But sometimes the damage isn't visible. Maybe it's a timing gear thrown off by a shock, or a worn main bearing that unraveled under strain. Things you can't see, but you can hear. A rattle, a knock, a hesitation. The engine loses its heart." He looked squarely at David, voice unwavering. "It's not the broken parts that break you, it's the heart." A hot tear carved a clean line through the grease on David's cheek. "I left them behind," he whispered, voice cracked, unused. "My friends, I left them. And then the dam broke. Guilt, fear, the weight of lives lost. A dusty roadside ambush. Orders in a flash. Survival's cruel lottery. The faces of his fallen, haunting him in daylight, chasing him in dreams. He had survived, but at a cost no badge could explain. Henry listened, without interrupting, no judgment, just the steady presence of a man who knew that silence could hold more than words. He had heard this story before, in war zones, in hospital wards, and in the bottom of bottle-laden bars. He had lived it. When David finally faltered, whole and trembling, Henry placed a strong hand on his shoulder. "The war ends," he said, voice thick with wisdom earned through decades. "They tell you it's over, then you come home. But coming home, that's a battle of its own, and you don't have to fight it alone." He pointed to the cracked distributor cap on the Jeep's engine. "The heart's broken, sure," he said gently, "but we can fix it, together." They worked into the late afternoon, Henry guiding brittle hands, teaching how to swap the cap, mend frayed wiring, perfect the spark timing. Every detail mattered. Life hinges on tiny connections. And while they worked, Henry spoke about his war, the guilt he'd carried, the years spent running, from memories, from love, from himself. He had never shared it except with Sarah. Now he bared it all to David. He showed his soul's scars, and in that unveiling, he taught that even the deepest wounds could mend. When the final bolt clicked into place, he said softly, "Try her now." David hesitated, fear flickering across his face. Then he climbed into the driver's seat, inhaled deeply, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, caught its breath, and roared to life with a strong, steady hum. A resurrection in steel. David looked up, eyes bright with a fire long extinguished. It wasn't just an engine restored, it was hope, crackling through the autumn air. In that moment, Henry knew his work was done. He hadn't just fixed metal, he had helped a young soldier begin to come home. Later, in the driveway, General Davenport waited. The old warrior's face was etched with gratitude deeper than any public accolade. He offered Henry money, a reward, anything. Henry shook his head. "He's a good kid, sir. Just listen to him. That's what he needs most." He returned to his modest garage. No fanfare, no headlines. But he carried something greater. Peace. Weeks passed. One morning, a different pickup rumbled in, old and battered, true, but with an engine ticking over smoothly. David emerged, clean-shaven, eyes clear, posture strong. In his hands was a small, carved wooden box. "I made this for you," he said, voice warm. Inside, nestled in velvet, lay a set of antique watchmaker's tools, each polished to shine. "My other grandfather fixed clocks," David said gently. "He told me it's about finding the rhythm again after something stops. I thought you'd understand." Henry stared at the tools, then at David, at the echo of past and promise of the future in that young man. The cycle was finally complete. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the garage in gold and shadow, Henry was wiping down his tools. Soon, his daughter and grandsons would arrive for dinner, and he could almost imagine the comforting aroma of Sarah's cooking drifting on the night air. A faint scuff of shoes broke the silence. Henry looked up. In the doorway stood a boy, no more than 13. His shirt was torn, his frame wiry with hunger, and his eyes carried the hollow desperation of someone who had been fighting battles far too big for his small shoulders. The boy's gaze fell on a broken motorcycle in the corner, a rusting relic with a flat tire, its chain twisted like a knot of sorrow. Then his eyes flicked back to Henry, and he swallowed hard before speaking. "Mister," he whispered, voice thin and shaking, "if I fix it, will you give me a meal?" For an instant, Henry was transported back in time. He saw himself as a younger man, drenched by rain, standing in front of a glittering dealership with nothing but desperation in his chest. But the man standing here now was no ghost. He was grounded, whole, alive. A slow smile spread across Henry's face, reaching his faded blue eyes and softening the scars of years. He reached for a clean rag, tossed it lightly to the boy, and said in a voice steady with kindness, "Son, you don't have to fix it for food, but you can help me fix it." And then, his eyes crinkled with warmth, "We'll sit down and eat together. Thank you for staying with this story. If it touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And stay tuned. More immersive stories are on the way.